What's up, Coach TJ?
We're back.
We're back.
Another week, another episode.
Another week, another episode. I feel like literally finished running like 7 minutes ago. I feel like this is the quickest turnaround I've ever done for a podcast.
Well, you're in the right mindset. You're in a runner's mindset right now.
Yeah, I just did a lovely recovery run. I've been really, as per our episode a couple weeks ago, focusing on taking my recovery days super chill. And oh my gosh, it feels so good to run easy.
Have you gotten to those 9-minute pace
Dude.
recovery runs
I had a
yet?
9:44 mile.
Oh, shit.
Sexy as hell.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah,
Nice
just
work.
absolutely trotting. Feeling
job.
so good. Like, it feels like, again, I know that, and this is always how I like coach athletes to talk or to understand this, is like, even at the easiest, running is still stress and always has to be understood that way. But like, it does feel like a light, like full body massage to just run like so ridiculously easy,
I like how when I run that easy, like my legs just feel really light and there's no stress.
I just
on
feel
the
like
skeletal
better.
system.
Like, I feel more energized, but also not like sometimes after workouts, I feel like a little too like I just,
Yes, the nervous system turns on
Yeah.
during those workouts.
Yes.
What you're describing is a heightened state of arousal.
Yeah. I don't love using that phrase.
But that's what the scientists would say.
I know that's what scientists would call it, but like if I came into an athlete meeting and was like, sorry, I'm late, I'm just really aroused, they would be out of that call so fast.
I think they would understand you're coming from a scientific perspective.
I don't know that they would.
Scientist of yourself.
I'm a scientist. I'm the correct amount of aroused right now. How about that? The correct amount of scientifically aroused.
I don't like
Am I
the path
making it
we're
worse?
going down here. We have to put a hard stop on this. What are we getting into today?
So we're going to talk a little bit about yearly mileage goals, the upsides, the downsides, and how to set and reach them. Then we're going to answer a couple. I pulled some questions from Reddit that I'm going to put Coach TJ on the spot with. So
Questions from Reddit.
he has not seen these. Sight unseen, he's going to have to give us his input on some training questions. Then I wanted to dive into this really cool study. So, in the running world, we're hearing a lot about nutrition periodization and particularly carbohydrate periodization, or the idea that restricting carbohydrates at certain times can have performance benefits and that taking in a lot of carbohydrates at certain times can have performance benefits. So we're going to look really, really closely at what the evidence says about carbohydrate restriction and periodization. And then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of zoom out from that study and talk about broader implications for athletes and how to periodize their nutrition. Similar with strength training, right? Like, your training should be, honestly, most things should be periodized. I believe that like most people's work days should be better periodized. I think that if companies really wanted people to be more productive, they would let you not just, be going at threshold effort 100% of the time, but
You only get 1 hour at threshold effort.
exactly 1 hour. It's
1 hour of work per day.
1 hour at 5K effort. So really sort of talking about how to make sure that you're meeting your nutritional needs in some different ways for thinking about nutrition and
Sounds
training.
good. I like how that builds off of what we discussed on one of our more recent podcasts about using your transition season as an opportunity to work on some of your fueling habits.
Yeah, I think that, again, so often, I'll be doing, the last deep dive, phone call with an athlete before their race. And I'm like, so what's your nutrition or what's your hydration strategy? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I'll just do whatever. And I'm like, ooh, oh my
no.
God, I'm
wrong
panicking.
time
That's
is
the wrong time.
Right before your race.
If you don't have something on the calendar, if you don't know what your 2025 goals are, A, reach out. B, right now is the time to do a sweat test. Unless of course you're going to be racing in dramatically different conditions. Right now is a great time to start practicing your fueling, to expand your palate, to start, trialing some different kinds of nutrition, both in the run and then outside of the run. Right now is a great season to really bring a new level of intention to your nutrition. So
Love it.
cool.
All right. Hot or not, yearly mileage goals.
What do you think, Coach TJ?
I'm going to say not hot. I'm going to actually come in with a perspective on this. I think not hot. The reason behind that is that I don't think playing for such specific outcomes is necessarily great for athletes when you're looking at it, like how nuanced an entire year of training should be. I think if you maybe want to have something loose, like I like to run around this amount, and if I can get that, that would be nice. Yeah, that's good to have, but certainly I don't think you want to shape your year in terms of like, what do I have to do to reach this amount of miles?
Yeah, as an outcome goal, I'm not in love with it. I could see it being beneficial if you also develop process goals to support it. But I think what happens so often is, like the new year rolls around, people set these aggressive mileage goals on Strava, and then there's no roadmap to meeting them, or there's no like intention behind like picking an arbitrary, like I picked 2,000 miles, like, okay. How is that informed by your past? How is that informed by the other goals that you have? And make sure that you're really trying to contextualize that rather than just picking an arbitrary number, because your body doesn't know or care what a mile is. So foisting an arbitrary goal upon it in that way, not helpful. What I think can be helpful is creating like a long-term framework that emphasizes consistency. And I think the reward for that framework will be probably meeting an ambitious yearly mileage goal.
I think some of the statistics that Strava pulled from 2022 are quite interesting, where only 22.8% of people finish within 80 to 90% of their goal. It's not a very high number at all.
Yep.
And then 13% were within 10% of their goal, so above 90%. And then for folks within a stone's throw, I guess a few percentages didn't quite make it there.
We have some tips for you.
Yeah, again, I don't think that data lies. I mean, that is just one data point.
Yeah.
But having that goal clearly didn't necessarily help the majority of those athletes reach their goals, right?
Yes.
So you kind of need to have the structures, the systems, the habits in place for to reach any goal, really, even if it's a numbers-based goal.
My hot take would be the best time to start reaching your 2025 yearly mileage goal is today. Start laying that foundation right now. So when you look at the data from Strava's Year in Sport, the toughest months to stay on track were November, December, and February. January is an anomaly where actually activity levels are quite high. People make those New Year's resolutions, but actually Strava in their Year in Sport actually identified a phenomenon called Quitter's Day, which is January 19th, which is the day that when you look at the aggregate of the Strava data, people's activities just absolutely tank on January 19th.
They don't even make it to
They don't even make it to February. So people come in hot to the new year. They have resolutions. And also, by the way, less than 9% of people in most studies self-report having stuck to their New Year's resolutions past 3 months. So
we've talked about that on the podcast before too. It's just not a great
It's not approach. A good framework. The odds of 9%, that's don't love those odds. So really focusing on consistency through the tough parts of the year right now. February, again, January, you're going to feel excited. All your friends are getting, into fitness. All the gyms have their fancy, New Year's deals. Resist that and think about how you can set yourself up for success now. There's a cognitive bias that our brains really like fresh starts, but oftentimes that actually leads us to put off building the habits that we need to actually reach those goals. So I would say free yourself from the arbitrary date of New Year's and start building towards your 2025 consistency right now.
So every little bit counts.
Yeah.
I like to think about that in terms of one of the building blocks for creating a consistent habit-based approach. If you set a distance standard for your runs, it's going to make it much more likely that you'll have the flexible mindset you need to stay consistent.
Yeah.
And so what I really recommend for athletes is to kind of have that standard of, I will do my run today, and what that looks like can vary depending on what your life circumstances are and what's actually happening in your environment. If you're programmed for a 40 to 50 minute run, but life only gives you 20 minutes, take the 20 minutes.
Yeah.
If you can't get that 40 to 50, that's okay.
Yeah.
But that 20 minutes will actually add towards that yearly goal rather doing nothing doesn't contribute anything to that
Yeah.
yearly goal.
Never let perfect be the enemy of good enough. And I think an interesting thing in the Strava data is that the median distance for folks who met their yearly mileage goal, the median distance of their individual runs was 24% higher than folks who didn't reach their goal. So that really goes to show that these big, like, long-term goals aren't achieved with like huge 100-mile weeks or heroic efforts, but it's actually just through weeks of easily attainable and consistent volume. So I know a lot of folks will put like, oh, if I reach like this specific volume, this many hours a week, or this many like arbitrary miles in a week, then, you know, XYZ will happen. And again, that's not really how our bodies work. And it's like, you know, folks who often have the go big or go home mindset around things often are the type that end up going home.
Ooh, that's rough.
Yeah. Tough to hear it.
Yeah, it is tough to hear.
Have you done a 100-mile training week?
Many?
Oh,
Yeah.
I haven't.
You'll get there.
Yeah,
You're
or not.
almost there.
Fine.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't
It's
matter.
just a number.
Just number. Just
you know?
wondering. I was just
What's
curious.
more important is, like, I don't know, maybe doing a 12-hour training week.
Yeah.
And thinking about, you know, am I running in the mountains?
I
That
feel-
might be equivalent to 100 miles on the road. Who knows?
Yeah, since really shifting my training to time-based training, I was like honestly a little bit scared about it at first because it's such a different approach, but I really feel like my brain has been rewired and I feel like I really better understand the intention behind all my runs. Like
Right.
it's been, because I was like honestly a little bit like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be so hard, but I'm gonna be doing so much less volume. Oh no, don't take my miles away from me. And I feel like so much less attached to any number and so much more in tune with my effort. So that would just be like, if you're, you know, if you're still training by distance, it could be worth it to consider switching that understanding towards time, particularly if you're doing any training off the roads.
Well, think about doing time-based training on the roads in winter compared to mileage-based training on the roads. What stress is more favorable to an ultra runner, do you think?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, off the roads.
The time-based training, though, on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
roads would
right.
be better because you'd probably be getting more mileage.
Right.
So if you went by miles, those miles go by quicker, and then all of a sudden you're not getting those training hours that you were getting before. Okay.
Just wanted to share that.
Yeah,
If anyone
good
else is
work.
like me and they're kind of a mileage diva, there is another way.
What are some other keys to this process? We're trying to set some goals here.
So looking at some data-driven insights. Another one is find a friend, actually, and a pet. People who logged runs with a friend or even with a pet had higher mileage overall. So folks who ran with other people actually ended up having a 17% higher goal completion rate. That's huge. So, you know, we talk about this all the time, but we are similar to the people that we surround ourselves with. So surrounding yourself with other athletes who are consistent and committed is a great way to hold yourself accountable too.
And consistency is key. I think we've kind of already hit on this point a couple times, but folks who meet their goal had a 15% more active days than goal setters who missed their goals. So I think it's important for us to realize that consistency is the name of the game here. If you want to meet your goals, you have to get out there consistently and set up a system and a framework that allows that to happen with as little friction as possible.
Yep. And then to quote one of my favorite writers, Brad Stulberg, don't aim to be consistently great. Aim to be great at being consistent.
Love it. All right, let's get into some questions
from Reddit. Are you ready, Coach TJ? So these are questions that I selected because they had the right amount of uncut gems, manic energy, and probably some tangible takeaways for our audience.
My gosh. Okay. I can't wait to
He's
get some
sweating.
uncut gems going on.
That's just
in
how
here.
like I always feel reading the ultra running Reddit, but okay.
Somebody's got their life on fast forward.
Yeah, exactly. I'm training for my first 100K, which is less than 6 weeks out. I just finished a 50K race on Saturday that I used as my longest training run of this cycle. I ran 51 miles last week, including the race, which is usually my peak week for an ultra. Usually, after I run a 50K, I would take a week off. But since I only have a few weeks left of training before the taper, I don't want to lose a whole week to recover. Should I be taking more days off before getting back into it, or am I okay to start easing back in and then trying to build my mileage for a couple more weeks before tapering?
So I'm just looking at the question one more time here. The 50K was, according to this athlete, the peak
long
run 6 weeks out from the race. Okay, pretty good timing there. I like that. 5 or 6 weeks out, I think should be about at the peak long run.
I think for a more advanced athlete, maybe even getting closer to 4 weeks out from a longer event.
Maybe. It depends.
Depends on the athlete.
On the life circumstances. I think I'd rather not take the risk of being 4 weeks out for a peak for the peak of a build, just because of the recovery time it takes to come back from these things. So I think this athlete's asking the right questions. The answer is she should take some rest after that 50K.
Yeah.
I would take 2 or 3 days off.
I think, like, for me,
depending on how hard she raced,
even if it was a higher volume, someone who had the context of higher, like, chronic training load, or like a more demonstrated ability to take on a different load, I would say maybe something different. But knowing that they usually average 40 to 45 miles a week, that's not huge volume, and so a 50K is like 90% of that.
Right.
So that to me really says, like, we need to make sure that we are recovered. And I always think about these things in sort of like a risk benefit analysis. Like, you have so much more to lose than to gain when it comes to coming back too soon. Like, you know, maybe you can sneak in a couple extra easy runs, but it's just not worth it when you think about, like, the fatigue that you're still going to be carrying after that race. Is your training really going to be that effective? And it will substantially increase your injury risk.
And also, just looking at the time course for adaptations, you've only got 5 more weeks till the race. So really, you've only got 3 potential weeks that you'd be training at a substantial level.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks of taper. And that 5th week, obviously, that's got to be somewhat of a recovery week, because you're coming off of the peak of the 50K. And not knowing what this athlete's training history and not knowing what their time of accumulated time for volume is per week, 40 to 45 miles, it's a number. I don't know how long it's taking them to run those miles. So that tells me, there's missing information here, unfortunately. But I think on the safe side, like, there's not a lot to gain from training 5 weeks out from the race.
How do you like people to treat, like, very long, like, focused efforts, like using an ultra in the context of training for another race? How do you like people to think about recovery after, like, a key effort or a focused long run like this?
I think if the athlete's racing hard, we take more recovery time.
Yeah.
If the athlete's treating it as a long run, where the pace is easy and it's not a race effort, so you might call that like eventing or something. Like, I'm just going to the 50K because they have aid stations,
right? And
it allows me to facilitate this longer run.
Yeah.
And it's easier than if I was to do that like on my local trails or in the neighborhood. The stress of those two things is going to be different. Yes, it's a long day. But I think then you can probably shorten up the recovery. But I wouldn't have them launch into any workouts, any intensity, or any super long runs in that first week back. Likely it'd be mostly forever effort or recovery, 4 out of 10 RPE runs, very easy. And then kind of gauging from there how the athlete's responding to that, and looking at some of the the physiological signs of recovery, like where's that athlete's HRV at, where's their resting heart rate, have they normalized or has it not normalized, and those kind of things to determine like exactly what the training architecture would be like. But likely that first week would be recovery. The second week, which would be 4 weeks out from the race, would be like a slight increase, but still less than the peak week. And then the third week out from the race would be maybe similar to that, like 4th week out, or less, or start tapering maybe a little bit there, even. So it kind of depends. There's a lot of nuance to this, a lot of things that I don't know about the athlete situation. But I think, like,
imagine someone on Reddit posting with inaccurate or incomplete information.
We just don't have all the info. But I think like a 50K is a substantial effort, whether you're running it at an easy effort and you're an experienced runner and you can do those longer runs as training for 100K, or you're racing that. And so you need to take the rest days that are kind of like equivalent to the effort that you're putting in there and the stress of that event.
This also sort of reminds me of something that I'll occasionally see with athletes, which is like panic training.
Right.
Whereas, like, I mean, you know, it again, like your weekly volume is heavily, I mean, it's completely dependent on your background, your stress levels, so many life context things. But oftentimes you're just gonna have, like, you're gonna have so much more success with like consistently a little more volume over time than like trying to like cram in a couple extra runs or workouts right after a huge event.
Yeah.
Like one of the reasons we stress consistency so much is so that you can adequately recover from these things, so that you are actually given the space to recover.
I think it's safe to assume that this athlete is probably feeling a little bit of pressure coming into that first 100K.
Yep.
And thinking about like, how do I maximize these last 5 weeks of training? It's just like, well, in that phase of training, you're likely going to be doing a lot more easy running, which has a long time course for adaptations. There's just really not a whole lot you're going to gain by doing risky training that close to that event, because those adaptations aren't going to set in for a long time.
Yeah.
So you can take the risk, and you might, like what you said, end up carrying over fatigue into that race that otherwise wouldn't have been there, and not have as great of an outcome at that race. Or you could just give yourself that extra recovery time and kind of like guarantee you might run 1 or 2 days less, or a little bit a few less training hours. But like for most 99% of folks, like that's going to be totally fine, and you're going to have probably a better race as a result.
Totally, right. Like if you have to, you know, obviously you should train correctly, but if you had to fall on the side of like being 10% undertrained or 10% overtrained, I'm picking 10% undertrained every single time, because you're at least healthy. If you're overtrained, all that work is for naught. You're still going to feel flat. You're still going to feel like shit. You're still like going to have a really hard time racing. Whereas like maybe if you're a tiny bit underbaked, at least you're healthy, right? Yep. Like I think people always think like I got to do more. And like they often don't perceive the risks of training in quite the same way that, you know, people who've been training for longer do.
The more is better bias or
fallacy. And then like I've got to do it all at the end because you know, I'm panic training. I didn't start doing this a year ago, and now I only have 5 weeks to get ready. There's just not much you can do in 5 weeks.
No, you could get yourself very hurt.
You can definitely get hurt in 5 weeks. You can definitely give yourself a career-ending injury.
You could.
Season ender, definitely. All right. Question number 2 from Reddit. I've been doing a 16-week training block for a trail 50K that takes place in mid-December. I'm just now coming off of losing 3 weeks to a nasty respiratory illness. So far, the longest run I've done in my program is only 20 miles. Given that the race is in less than 2 weeks, would you cut your losses and skip the race, or go ahead and risk a DNF?
It's a good values proposition here, I think, for the athlete to consider. Like what would be what would be the best course of action for them based on what you know they value in the process. I think the longest run they've done is 20 miles. I have no idea what their training history is. You know, maybe this is an athlete who's run dozens of 50Ks and is like, you know, it's only 12 more miles than my longest run, and I've done this before. I can just go at an easy pace, and it'll take me a while, but I'll get it done, and it won't be a risk. But I don't know. It kind of I think, but like you can imply from this that like they're asking this question, so probably they're a newer runner.
I would also say over input or thinking, the long run is not the biggest predictor of ultramarathon success, but oftentimes newer ultrarunners think that that the long run is the key. And like it is important, but there's not like
I'm just gonna come at you with something slightly different, because you're right. You're right about that. The long run is not necessarily the most important thing.
Yeah.
But this person's only done one 20-mile run in 16 weeks.
That's not ideal.
I mean, again, we don't know if their programming is by miles or by time. What's their longest run by time? I am going to go ahead and guess
it's by miles.
Yeah. So I would say probably they're underprepared. They should. Yeah. I would probably not do it.
I would probably high risk. I would say it's pretty high risk, especially if you were sick for, here's what, you know, my Sherlock Holmesy take is like, if you were sick for 3 weeks, that to me indicates that your life stress is high enough that your immune system is at minimum not crushing it.
Sure.
And that this is a pretty big risk in the context of higher life stress. This is also assuming that after 3 weeks of this illness, you now feel amazing and you're ready to like dive into training, which oftentimes, I mean, with 3 weeks off, like at that point, you have to reduce volume significantly and then like, you know, build it back up and then taper back down.
But they're in their taper.
Right. So like you can't, yes. So it's going to be, it would be a huge risk. I would definitely advise against it. And, you know, I always caution, like athletes should not race sick. It's just not worth it because it can have really detrimental long-term health impacts. And that's something we always want to avoid. And it's just not worth it for a 50K. Like your long-term health is so much more important and your potential is so much. Yes. And your potential is never just like the next 50K. It's always on the horizon and you have to train accordingly. And again, just like if I see an athlete that is persistently sick for like multiple weeks, that to me would indicate that just our health context is not one that we should really be racing in or taking big training risks. And that to me indicates that we're not recovering. Maybe we need to talk about nutrition or relative energy deficiency, thinking about stress management. And, you know, I think there's bigger training wins to be had here beyond racing a 50K.
Yeah. Well, we're making on both of these questions, you know, we're making
you
ton
have
of assumptions.
Okay, the internet is there to make assumptions.
Information, but I think one of the flaws of doing one of these like 16-week training blocks to a 50K that you find on the internet is like a lot of people they're kind of starting from the ground floor.
Yeah.
On those, and so like the bulk of the big miles are kind of right in that like 6 to 8 week period from the start of the race.
Yeah. And
it puts a lot of stress on that athlete to have everything go right in those weeks of training, to have the confidence to then go and start the race. And one of the benefits of taking a much longer approach where you're training all year round and your average volume is higher all year round is that like ideally you wouldn't be 2 weeks out from the race and only completed one 20-mile run.
Yeah.
Like, because a good 16-week plan, you should probably be pushing 20 miles like a few times way before 6 weeks out from the race.
Yeah.
And like there's some stuff that I see out there around like certain number of hours you need to complete in training in a certain period in order to be successful. And I think like if quality is high, some of those things do play as true. But I never try to put all of that training concentrated into one area for my athletes. Like if I can have an athlete do, you know, X number of 9 or 11 hour or whatever it is, you know, training weeks, already doing that 16 weeks out from a race, way better than if we're cramming that in. So some of these things that you find on the internet, I think
these are also, by the way, these are like great. The best questions.
Yeah, for sure. But those
like,
builds that
this is the cream of the crop.
just
Everything else,
tough.
like I'll let you bring a sampling of questions next time, just so that you can dip your toe into the fetid water that is Reddit ultrarunning.
I don't do Reddit. I do Reddit jazz.
You should, because people do say really nice things about us on Reddit.
I appreciate those people for, you know, we get a few referrals that way, and that's always nice. But I don't go onto the edges of the internet. Like,
this isn't the edge. This is like
Reddit,
the dead center.
There's some stuff on Reddit.
Yeah, I mean, just depending on which Reddit to get on. Yeah, it's not 4chan.
I do my Reddit jazz, and that's as far as I go.
Reddit/jazz.
I think so.
Yeah. That sounds cute. Great.
It's nice.
So here I want to talk about a really cool scientific study that investigates the effects of a 5-week periodized carbohydrate diet compared to a consistently high carbohydrate diet. One of the caveats to this is that it was tested on well-trained cyclists' performance. So it's not a one-to-one of the population we work with, because I don't coach any elite or professional cyclists. But I think that it still has some really important takeaways. So This research looks to determine if varying your carbohydrate intake can enhance maximal lactate steady state, or MLSS, exercise capacity, and if it can alter substrate oxidation rates. So what that means is fat oxidation, or your ability to burn fat as your primary fuel source. So in the world of ultra running, particularly in the manosphere, you hear a lot about fat oxidation or restricting carbohydrates, or LCHF, low carb, high fat, with the idea that restricting your carbohydrate intake will push your body to rely on fat more as a source of fuel. So there are a lot of goals purportedly that people try to achieve with carbohydrate periodization, and the primary one is that increased fat oxidation I was talking about. So many people think that the low carbohydrate strategy will help them utilize. So the idea here is that an athlete will utilize carbohydrate for energy if it's available. Therefore, according to this train of thought, restricting carbohydrate intake presumably would force the body to use more fat for fuel during exercise. The body then adapts to increase its capacity for fat oxidation, enabling athletes to burn more fat, even when carbohydrate in the form of stored glycogen and exogenous carbohydrates like gels is readily available. So this is partly accurate, but the number one thing you can do to increase your ability to burn fat as fuel is aerobic-based training. Just running easy is more effective at increasing your fat substrate use than trying to finagle your carbohydrate intake.
That's a big spoiler alert on this.
Yes, I'm burying the lead. But I don't want people to listen to that paragraph and think wait, is Zoe going to tell me to restrict carbs? Well, I'm not telling you anything. I'm reporting the results of this study that tell you to not restrict carbs. But that's the point here. The number one thing that affects your ability to burn fat as fuel is how much aerobic based training you're doing. I actually
was checking out a study recently where they essentially created a relative energy deficit in some of the participants, and then they had a control group, and the participants that had a low energy availability, their ability to utilize fat for fuel went up over the first 3 days, and then significantly reduced after. So some of the long-term, there's very little long-term benefit from having that restrictive, and it's highly dangerous.
It's highly dangerous. Particularly, you know how the joke is that men think about the Roman Empire all the time?
No.
You haven't heard of this?
No, I thought they thought about tactical things.
Well, also that, but there was a meme that men are constantly thinking about the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Don't you think about the Roman Empire sometimes?
I saw Gladiator recently.
Right, but don't you just sometimes think about it?
No.
Never? You
God,
never think about the
weird.
Roman Empire?
No.
Okay, so apparently all other men are
Stoics and
Caesar.
Yeah,
exactly. They're
Caesar,
okay,
right.
aqueducts, togas.
Aqueducts,
togas. They love water
swords.
infrastructure, swords, lots of cool shit.
Colosseums.
So my ancient Rome is the study that showed that women who even had calorie deficits of 200, 300 calories within day energy deficits, it dramatically increased their risk of bone injury.
Right.
So it's way less fun than Gladiator, the Roman Empire. But my Roman Empire is the fact that women are so susceptible, and particularly for even within day carbohydrate deficits. So even if you're a female athlete who's meeting their overall energy needs, but the macros aren't correct and you're not getting enough carbohydrates, even that can do things like impact your thyroid health and increase your risk of injury. So particularly for women, restricting carbohydrate, not the way to go. And for men, if you say that the thing you want to do is to improve your body's ability to oxidize fat, restricting carbohydrates, not the way to do that. Aerobic-based training, that's the way to do it. So another thing that sometimes people will try to do with carbohydrate periodization is increase the use of exogenous or consumed carbohydrates. So on the other end of the spectrum, athletes are strategically increasing their carbohydrate consumption before and during exercise. And that's a strategy for obviously getting in more carbohydrates. And research shows that to an extent, carbohydrate oxidation increases when availability increases.
Right.
So that can be beneficial for sparing those glycogen stores and delaying the onset of fatigue, which means maintaining a higher blood glucose level throughout prolonged exercise, which in turn can actually increase the capacity for high intensity efforts, like, the acceleration you need to win a race late in a competition. So the caveat here is that this strategy is going to require gut training to help, an athlete's body and gut become accustomed to consuming and processing larger volumes. And here I'm speaking 90 plus grams of carbohydrate an hour of fuel without suffering gastric distress. And, this is one where, especially with like the David Roche of it all receiving a lot of attention, and it's really cool to see people thinking about like, oh, actually, like, can we push the fueling envelope? But the caveat there is that that's not going to be appropriate for everyone, and you have to practice it in training, and particularly for female athletes, that like going way beyond that 90 grams just may not be as possible for different people. So
I think culturally, one of the real reasons why we see people trying to periodize their carbohydrate intake is because they think it will help them with weight loss.
Yes.
And that like is pretty tough, because I think also there's a lot of scientific data to support that this actually could have like the reverse effect.
Yep.
And so, when you're restricting carbohydrates as opposed to protein or fat, that's going to actually affect like the quality of your training, because you don't have those carbohydrates on board, and they are the main fuel source of aerobic activity. And so there's this misconception that, well, if I don't eat these carbs, then, I'll be leaner, because carbs, they make you fat, and they're the enemy because of that. And so I need to like reduce them to manage my weight and all that. But like, if you're an athlete, forget about it, because you're just going to feel like crap on your runs.
And the truth of it is that you cannot have a goal to lose weight and increase performance. I know that's like,
doesn't work.
It's a tough thing for a lot of athletes to hear, but if you are losing weight, you are not getting better at running. In order to get better at running, you need to increase your body's ability to adapt to the stimulus, and you can only do that in the presence of sufficient and abundant energy.
Exactly. Tons of protein, tons of carbohydrates, an appropriate amount of fats, micro and macronutrients. It's super important.
Yeah. So some people will find that when they go on a low-carb diet, many people in the short term will lose weight. That is not because anything special happens with your metabolism. That is just because you are simply restricting your overall calorie intake, looking at like the studies. And that's kind of how like most diets that purport to have some like fancy metabolic effect, like paleo, keto, no, there's nothing special or fancy happening. You're losing weight because you're eating less, and that should not be the goal of athletes. So yes, in the short term, reducing carbohydrate intake can reduce the number of calories you're taking in. Again, not the ideal goal for an athlete. Athletes often reduce their carbohydrate intake in an unplanned, inefficient, sort of like non-strategic way. So that can lead to excessive carbohydrate restriction that's going to really hinder your performance. So what you'll see with that is suppressed immune function, delays in post-exercise recovery, increased risk for low energy availability, and relative energy deficiency in sport, or that red S we were talking about earlier.
So participants in this study, they were well-trained cyclists. They had a training history already. They were divided into two groups. They had a periodized carbohydrate diet group, and those participants followed a diet with alternating high and low carbohydrate intake phases over 5 weeks. And then there was just a high carb diet group, and those participants maintained a consistent high carb diet throughout the study period. What were some of those key findings?
So I would definitely want to be in the high carb group. If anyone's looking for a study
I feel
participant,
much more
I love
satiated
carbs.
just thinking about it.
Yeah. But the key findings was that there was no significant difference between the two groups in terms of MLSS exercise capacity. And both groups exhibited similar rates of carbohydrate and fat oxidation during exercise.
So interesting.
I think that's really interesting. So this study concludes that a periodized carbohydrate diet doesn't offer any additional benefits over a consistently high carbohydrate diet when it comes to improving MLSS exercise capacity or altering your substrate oxidation in well-trained cyclists. So again, if you're trying to change your body's ability to oxidize fat, which isn't a bad goal, like we want to be able to burn fat, especially like for, ultrarunners, folks really performing in that aerobic zone. But the best way to do that is aerobic training, not trying to alter your fueling in a way that can have really detrimental downstream impacts.
Well, and I think that's the biggest takeaway. Okay, so I see that there's no difference between these two. I'm going to go with what is popularized on Instagram or what I heard Huberman talking about or Joe Rogan or some guy out there. And so I'm going to go and periodize, and I'm going to do fasting, or I'm going to do some runs not fueled because it doesn't hurt, and maybe I'm going to lose a little weight.
Or it doesn't hurt performance, but we know that long term.
I'm sorry, what I meant to say was it doesn't benefit performance, but maybe I'll lose a little weight along the way, or maybe I'll emotionally I'm going to feel more connected to that because of what I see going on culturally as a validation of my thoughts around this. Well, the downstream effects of that are red S, increased injury risk, lower the possibility of having worse training outcomes in terms of quality. Not having those carbohydrates on board at the right times could impact stuff like your output levels in speed work or your ability to run that extra hour in your long run without slogging or having your nervous system kind of collapse out from under you and your RPEs take off.
It's simply a bad bet. If you were guaranteed there's no payoff, why would you risk all of these hormonal impacts, immune impacts, not increased diminished ability to recover for women, huge increase in chance for menstrual dysfunction, for reproductive dysfunction, for actually even, in women, it's been relative energy deficiency has been tied to mental health, anxiety, and depression. And so why would you risk all of those things for the exact same, at best, the same outcome?
Well, it's a feeling.
When you
it's
could just,
it's an emotional need that a lot of these
we're all
athletes
drawn
are
to the bright, shiny object.
The silver bullet.
Yep.
You just need to do a couple runs fasted. You need to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to totally change the game. And it's actually, you just need to train for about 20 years.
Yeah.
And then you'll
just run easy
kind of know
what
to do.
Yeah.
You need to have a well-balanced training plan for 20 years, and then you'll be able to oxidize fat better and utilize that as a primary fuel source as you get faster and faster and you enter these different training zones in your races and all of that stuff. It's just actually, sorry, no silver bullets.
Yeah. And so we're going to touch briefly on how to periodize nutrition here with the caveat that if you're someone who's really, really interested in optimizing and diving deep into this stuff, I'm always going to recommend that you reach out to our RDN, Kylie Van Horn at Fly Nutrition, because she is amazing at helping tailor specific training programs to meet people's specific training needs. She looks at my Training Peaks account and can help me dial in my exact carbohydrate needs for workout days, long runs. And if you're really interested in this stuff, always work with a professional. But just to sort of give broad strokes overview of what this means, because I think a lot of athletes aren't always aware of what nutrition periodization actually is.
Right.
And what it means is increasing your fueling to meet what you're doing.
Well, what's the purpose behind it? The purpose is to optimize.
Yes.
Optimize.
Yeah.
And that's to optimize the training.
Correct.
The training outcomes.
Yep.
Not to change your body mass.
Yeah.
Or to lose weight or something like that. This is to optimize your performance and your training outcomes.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's really important when we talk about this to put that right out there at the beginning.
Correct. And I think another big caveat is when we talk about increasing fueling needs for hard days, But what we don't talk about is restricting food on down days, right? Like
Right.
when an athlete is injured, or when you're recovering from a race, when you're tapering for a race, when your activity level is reduced, that is not an invitation to restrict. In fact, those downtimes, like particularly rest days, tapers, recovering from races, your body will be better able to absorb nutrients when it's not experiencing the same stress as it is day in and day out of training. So
Right.
making sure that you're not restricting on rest days is really, really key here. Do you have to drink the exact same protein shake that you would on your long run day? No, you don't. But the framework here is not restriction.
So what does this all mean? It really means two main things. Match your nutritional needs to your training goals and reduce the risk of overtraining. And so when we talk about matching our nutritional needs to our training goals, we're really talking about during high intensity or high peaks in volume during training, the body needs more fuel, particularly carbohydrates to support energy demands. And then also it needs protein to support the recovery from these training loads.
Yeah.
In low intensity or recovery periods, the focus is going to be to shift to recovery and to repairing muscle tissue. So then you're going to have some different needs there too. And then when we're talking about that point number two of reducing the risk of overtraining, we have to have proper periodization, ensuring that there's adequate energy availability during these critical phases. So that way you don't put yourself at risk for injury. For red S, any of these things. So when you're getting that proper fueling in, it actually reduces your like likelihood of having hormonal imbalance, having injury, having prolonged periods of fatigue, etc. What does it look like in practice?
So it just means you're adjusting your daily nutrition to meet the specific needs of that day. So for high intensity days like a workout or a long run, you're really going to want to focus on carbohydrate rich meals before and also after
Right.
to replenish your glycogen stores, particularly for any athletes doing doubles, cross training, doing strength training. You do want to make sure that you get in. It's not like you just want to hit a block of tofu immediately after the effort. Sort of
You need
looking
to have
for
some
that.
carbohydrates.
Yeah, like a 4-to-1 ratio is great. But, essentially just like a well-balanced meal that emphasizes both protein and carbohydrates. So our rule of thumb for athletes is 1 gram of protein for every pound of body weight is a great ballpark to shoot for. So this is like grain bowls are great, pasta's great, smoothies are great. And we hear a lot about sort of the myth of the 30-minute window. You're still able to like replenish glycogen stores and you're still able to synthesize protein more than 30 minutes after your workout. However, it's sort of like hitting the snooze button on your recovery. And if the goal of doing training is to adapt to it, why would you delay the recovery process? So definitely try to get in that post-workout recovery meal, that shake, whatever your go-to snack meal is, as soon as possible, because you'll start adapting sooner, faster, and better. But this is also not permission that if you are outside of that window to say, well, I missed the window, why even bother fueling? Definitely still fuel.
Right. Again, go back to those principles of this doesn't need to be perfect to
Yes.
work. Something is better than nothing.
The 30-minute window is sort of a myth and sort of like a mistake of science communication where people used to sort of believe if you told people, like you had to tell people they had to eat in that 30-minute window, otherwise they wouldn't. However, I think that it inadvertently pushes people into that black or white thinking that we often know means that people will just end up saying like, well, miss the window, might as well not eat. And it's always, always, always going to be best and most efficient to fuel when you can. Most optimally, yes, within that 30 minutes. But, throughout the day, it's always so, so important. And particularly for your workout days, particularly for your long run days, particularly if you're doing another bout of activity or if it's like a back-to-back long run situation. So on recovery days or lower intensity runs, so maybe a rest day or a day where you just have like a super easy recovery run, you don't have to focus as much on, you don't need to focus on dramatically increasing that carbohydrate intake. And this is really where you can make sure that you're getting in enough healthy fats and proteins for recovery. So this is like a great time to eat eggs, some avocado, salads with nuts and seeds, and get some, tofu, get a lean protein in there. And another way to think about periodized nutrition is in specific training blocks. So, in a build phase, higher overall caloric intake and carbohydrates to make sure that you're meeting your energy demands when you're building mileage and you're building intensity. If you're building volume and your diet isn't changing, you're not doing something right. I know that that sounds obvious, but like so often people don't do it. They just think, oh, I'll listen to my hunger. And a lot of times for folks, that isn't always going to be the right approach because your ghrelin and leptin levels change when you're exercising a lot. And so your hunger could become not the most accurate cue always, especially for folks with suppressed appetites. Looking at you, sometimes you will have to eat a little bit mechanically to make sure that you're meeting your energy needs.
Yep.
And then another way of periodizing nutrition is race week, and looking into carb loading strategies to maximize your glycogen stores. And again, making sure that you start that 2 to 3 days before the race, and it's not just all about that spaghetti dinner, the dinner before the race.
Yeah. Protein timing too, we kind of already touched on this, but 20 to 30 grams of protein after your runs is really helpful for recovery along with those carbs. Kind of get that process started and work towards that getting 1 gram per pound of body weight in per day. It's a really good ballpark to reach. I know for myself, it really helped to use an app called Chronometer to track these things so I could actually confirm like, oh, my average is 150 to 160 grams of protein a day.
Yeah.
Like, that's with these habits.
Yeah.
And to just to see where you're at. And I know it feels a bit myopic to, like, look at all your labels and track your stuff. But when we're talking about our health and longevity as athletes, like, it really makes sense to go to that level to ensure that you're getting what you need. So there's no question. Because for most people, they're guessing at this stuff.
Yeah.
For most people, it's vibes.
I think
it's not actually based on they sat down and tracked it for a few days to be sure. Like, I think I know. Oh, I didn't really know that I only had 3 grams of protein. I thought that was 10. I'm like, well, that's a huge difference, and you're only getting 1 serving of it. So...
Yeah, I don't think I've ever, anytime I've assigned an athlete to like sort of benchmark their protein intake, I don't think anyone's ever come back and said, yeah, I'm meeting I'm meeting what I should be.
Right.
Like every time people are under, and usually by like a pretty significant margin. And so for folks for whom they have a relationship with food and tracking, that's a tool that they can use and that won't lead to negative self-judgment or disordered patterns. Chronometer is an amazing tool, and I really like that. But especially for protein, you really just sort of need a back of napkin calculation. Yeah. Vibes, not specific enough, but you don't need to like get down to the like 0.01 tenth of a gram on protein.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting about using something like that. And I'm not somebody who has a history of disordered eating, so I don't have an issue looking at those things. So this is going to be different for folks with different background than me. But what I found was that I was actually underestimating what some of the protein that made up some of the other foods that I ate.
Like you were not counting it in like leafy greens and stuff.
Yeah. Or the oatmeal in the morning or the granola. Like, I know those things have protein, but I kind of just didn't care how much.
Yeah.
But I actually saw that those things were like adding up to fairly significant numbers, like small amounts repeated add up. And it helped me to just get a more holistic view of like, okay, I am eating a more balanced diet than I thought. Like I thought my diet was pretty good. I don't put a ton of effort and focus into it. I think I put enough into it to recover and perform well. And then I was like, this is actually
we have upped our tofu game.
We did, yeah, we did. But and I did this chronometer after we made those adjustments a couple years ago. But I don't know. For me, it was like, wow, you kind of underestimated yourself, and you're on the right track here, but you do need to keep doing these things in order to meet these needs.
Yeah.
And it also told me some stuff that I should consider like work on, which was really helpful. Other stuff like antioxidants, and are you, having a variety of different like fruits and vegetables, and are you getting berries and other things that like can be helpful for recovery too.
Right.
It's not just about whether
It's not just eating raw beef.
pasta and meatballs.
Yeah.
Yes, that's carbs and protein.
Although you would be very happy just eating pasta and meatballs
you know,
every day.
it's just so low input. I don't have to think about it. And that helps at the end of a long day.
Yeah. But the overall message here is like, if you want to get the most out of your long runs and workouts, make sure that you are being strategic, particularly about that carbohydrate intake before, and that you're being strategic about that protein intake after. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't restrict carbs. That's the lesson for today.
I'm about to go try to get some carbs in tonight.
Yeah. And then the other lesson is, if you want advice on Reddit, make sure that you post your entire training history so that we can judge you accordingly.
There will be no judgment from me. I will try to give you actionable feedback that'll help you. But gosh, people, if you're on Reddit, give some more information so we can really help.
Yeah.
God, there's
it's
not
sometimes
enough.
like you
It's
can
so hard.
tell how little someone knows by what they think the most relevant info is, you
Yeah.
know? So
Boy, it makes me
that's why
realize
it has
like
Uncut Gems energy.
it's like how I can practice trying to be like as
Loving.
unbiased as I can be.
Yeah.
When I actually have real coaching sessions where I'm not making any assumptions on things.
Right.
Instead to ask the question. And here I have to make all these assumptions in order to answer the question.
Yeah.
So it gives me kind of the flip of
Right.
the flip side of it all. So thank you, Reddit. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Reddit.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Hope you found this helpful. Reach out. Microcosm coaching@gmail.com, microcosm-coaching.com. We're trying to compile some more hot or not topics for 2025. So send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.